So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our three fantastic contributors to today's discussion. I'm first going to introduce our moderator, Arif Jan Mohammed, who is a Montrealer originally, now based in the Bay Area. He's a general partner at Lightspeed. Arif has a fascinating career that we could do a whole, probably a whole session on. But he has, basically started as a chip designer and a product manager in the 90s, and spent his whole career really working in the venture-backed tech startup world, Web TV, Andes Networks, and then made his way into investing at Lightspeed, which, for those of you who don't know, really is one of the preeminent top-tier Silicon Valley venture funds. And he is our plainclothes Canadian in that space. Arif is an investor and on the board of Netskope, the CEO and founder of which is also one of our discussion leaders today, Sanjay Beri, who's a Torontonian originally, now based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I will leave his bio for Arif to help introduce him. And then we're also so grateful for Galina Antova, who is a Canadian entrepreneur based in the Bay Area, calls Toronto home. And you'll notice that all of our panelists today are wearing fantastic Canadian garb, and whether Raptors or Team Canada garb. So I'm going to pass it over to Arif to kick us off. Thank you three so much for your time. And we are all ears, so much to learn about what's going on in the cybersecurity space, particularly as we're all digitizing and working from home.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much, Laura. And I should have taken notes because that was a fantastic introduction. You really mastered the art of the intro. I feel really special. One thing you didn't mention was that I've been involved with the C100 for over a decade. In fact, it was hatched at a Canadian trade conference roundtable with Anthony Lee and Chris Albinson, and I've been really privileged and humbled to have been a founding charter member, a founding board member, and have seen this organization just blossom over the last decade and just really thrive under Laura and Andre and other people's leadership in the last year or two. So it's just been amazing to see how far the C100 has come. A little bit about Lightspeed. We are a global venture capital firm. We're headquartered in Menlo Park, California, which is in Silicon Valley, but we've got offices in Israel, in India, in China, in the UK, and Singapore. We love to do early stage investing. In fact, we were one of the earliest investors in Netskope, but we've got a truly global platform with three fund families: an early stage family, a growth stage family, and a global opportunity family. And we do a lot of work across enterprise, across consumer, and in life sciences. And some of the companies we've been really lucky to have backed over the years, including Netskope, are AppDynamics, Nutanix, MuleSoft, Snapchat, Honest Company, Giphy, and a bunch of others. So really, this should be a really fun panel because at Lightspeed we've been really looking at areas that have seen both upticks as well as tailwinds as a result of COVID. And the last 3 months have been disruptive for a lot of us. In many ways, we're all working from home. I'm in my living room over here. My kid just picked up his breakfast right behind me. We're adapting to virtual meetings. We're adapting to virtual selling. We're adapting to really building companies remotely. And one of the areas that has seen a lot of uptick is cybersecurity, and that's why it'll be so much fun to hear from both Sanjay and Galina about how this has affected their business. But before we dive into that, I thought it'd be fun to do some personal introductions. And so I'd love to first start with Galina. And Galina, you are on mute, but Galina, I'd love to start with you. A little bit about yourself. Let's keep this personal first. Where are you from? Where you grew up? How you came to the Bay Area? And then what you miss most about Canada.
Thanks, Arif. So first of all, glad to see everyone, lots of Canadians on the call today. And thank you so much, Laura, for kind of maintaining the community. So I've lived all over the world. I've lived in like 7 different countries on 4 continents. I've spent most of my adult life in Canada and then left. So my family is still in Toronto. I left Canada 10 years ago to go and do my MBA in Switzerland. And then from then did some work in Europe, went back to the US. So really been all over the place. And I just must say that there's just no better place than Canada. And if it wasn't for the weather and if it wasn't for all the business opportunities, I'll probably still be there like many of us. But really just in terms of culture and how welcome people are, it's just an incredible place to be. And so that's probably what I miss the most about Canada is just the people and how nice everyone is. That's a little bit about my personal background. I spent a bunch of years in New York as I was building Claroty, and I just recently moved to the Bay Area. So I look forward to making some new friends and new contacts here.
Awesome. And Sanjay, same question, a little bit about yourself, where you grew up,
Sure.
And what your journey was to the Bay Area and what do you miss most about Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Arif. And Galina, we hadn't met previously before, so great to have met in some of the pre-calls and so on as well. That's a great background. I think I was born in Toronto. Actually, to be fair, I was born in Etobicoke. So for those who are born in Canada, I can't call it Toronto, the GTA, I guess. But born in Toronto and first generation Canadian, and along with my brother, and grew up there. Went to school there. Went to Waterloo there. Played various sports there, and grew up in the Canadian culture. So loved it. Moved permanently to the U.S. Just after Waterloo, and moved out to the Bay Area. I lived in Seattle for maybe a year and a half before, but settled in the Bay. Met my wife, my daughter, so on, and so the Bay is home. I actually love the snow, but my family couldn't necessarily tolerate the minus 20 Celsius. And so that's a little about myself. As far as professionally, look, I spent my life more in what I call the networking security arena, creating many of the security problems by working at Microsoft in the early 90s. And then fast forward, started Netskope, my second company, but started Netskope in 2012. And so super happy to be here in the Bay, working with some great folks, C100, great org, love it. Should probably participate more, but this is one of those, hopefully, that I'm doing. And I think just from another perspective, what I miss most, actually, Galina said it best, you miss your family. I got a lot of family back in Canada, a lot of friends, all the way from, grade 3 to university, right? And so you miss those folks. And of course, the Raptors and the Leafs, with the Raptors repeating this year, hopefully. But anyways, that's it.
Looks like I'm outnumbered with 2 Torontonians Leafs fans, while I'm a Montreal Habs fan. So, but it's funny. I was also born in Toronto. Sanjay, tell us a little bit about Netskope. What is Netskope? What problem do you solve? And a little bit about the history of the company.
Yeah. So if you look at Netskope, and you look at a lot of the trends that we're all experiencing that have been accentuated with COVID, you notice this notion of, hey, work from home, right? 70% of enterprise users are working from home. You look at people bring their own device. You look at the way, business works with partners and so on. The way people work has changed. And it didn't change because of COVID. It was changing 10 years ago. They were accessing cloud. The whole concept of how people work was changing. We call that digital transformation, right? Digital transformation meant you needed to transform your security stack, something that accounted for the way that people work. And so Netskope was really formed with the notion that as you transform digitally, which has been accelerated with COVID, you need to transform your security stack, and your data network security stack is the biggest market in security. And that's why Netskope was formed. It was to be the definitive platform, the iconic company that would dominate data and network security. And I know it's a bold statement, but I think Netskope was not formed to be a small company to sell a module. A lot of us, this is our legacy. And so we're really here to dominate that data network security market as people digitally transformed. Started in 2012, fast forward, ours being one of our first investors, been on our board ever since, We're about 1,200 people now across the world. We serve, close to a third of the Fortune 100. And we're really fortunate, I think, to just have some killer people, including Arf and many other folks, Canadians I see on the call, CPP, PSP, also part of the company. So anyways, that's a quick Reader's Digest of Netskope.
Awesome. And Galina, also, could you tell us a little bit about your company, what you do, what problems you solve, and some of the history of why you started that company and how it's evolved?
Yeah. So Claroty focuses on a domain that's relatively new. So that is the operational technology networks that run basically the critical infrastructure of the world. And it's a part of cybersecurity. It's a part of kind of the networking stack that has been ignored for a really long time, because traditionally those networks and the equipment on them used to be air-gapped. So if you think about electric utilities, power plants, manufacturing, all of that runs on operational technology networks, or industrial control systems, as we call them. And so as part of the digital transformation journey that Sanjay is talking about, this very much affected the connectivity to those networks. And so it just became a white spot within cybersecurity that we wanted to address. From an ambition perspective, this was a great market opportunity, just because every single company in the world has a component of operational technology, whether they think about it in this way or not. But even if you just have a office building, you've got things like building management systems and elevators and escalators and lights, and all of that is operational technology. So Claroty was started 5 years ago. Basically, how I got the insight for this part of the industry was I spent the previous years, 3 years before that, with Siemens, where it was pretty clear that a lot of the Fortune 500 customers are asking for those solutions, and none of the large IT companies were actually specifically designing products for them. So we started Claroty 5 years ago. We were, again, I think, at a very right time of the market when a lot of the Fortune 500 started buying solutions for that vertical, for that specific portion of their network. We have raised $100 million, and we're smaller than Netskope, but I think that we're on the same kind of trajectory, and we definitely have the same ambition. I very much like what Sanjay said about being the platform, right? So not just being a module and being a feature, but really being the platform for those critical infrastructure networks that run the world. We've got customers in 18 different vertical segments in over 50 countries around the world, about 200 employees globally. And yeah, we're working on that kind of area of critical infrastructure. Obviously, COVID has disrupted that a lot and actually accelerated our journey quite a lot, and we'll get into a little bit more details later on.
Well, why don't we talk specifically about that? You both mentioned digital transformation, and Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella about two months ago on his earnings call said that 3 years of digital transformation has happened in 3 months. And so we're absolutely seeing a change in the way that enterprises around the world are really shifting their enterprise stack, shifting their application stack, and shifting their security stack. So I'd be curious to hear from both of you, and maybe Galina, we can start with you on the operational technology side, how COVID has really changed basically for your company and for your customers, and what you're doing as and I'll use the words of the C100, as a white knight to fight back.
Right. So let's start with the customers first. So I think you're absolutely right. I think digital transformation and the speed at which companies are adopting that depends on their willingness to basically drive it fast and disrupt themselves. So COVID just forced all of us to move faster. That's the reality. I don't think that anyone did anything extraordinary in terms of like just the resources were focused and companies actually executed on that. Actually, there's probably one silver lining out of this whole situation was that executives realized that A, it's possible, and B, it's not only a defensive measure against a crisis, it actually gives them a competitive advantage. So specifically for operational technology, there basically a lot of our customers, like whether that's manufacturing or oil and gas, had to switch to having a lot of their maintenance and engineers working offsite, which is extremely difficult when you're trying to run a physical process with people that are not actually on site. So that meant that they have to have pretty secure, remote access. They have to think through all of the security procedures, and obviously they have the technologies that enable that. This is where obviously my company comes into play. And so from a deployment perspective, actually, we saw for the first time ever, companies going directly to like buying the product or just doing mini proof of concepts rather than this like elaborate 3 months. So it just it was a good momentum for my company. I think it showed our customers that you don't have to go through this complicated process. A lot of it is just self-imposed complication, and you can actually get things done if you get focused on that. So going forward, I don't think that there'll be a going back to the normal. I think once companies experience this kind of more distributed way of doing things and saw that it's possible with the right focus and resources, we expect this to kind of continue to be the norm going forward.
Awesome. And Sanjay, 8 years ago in 2012, when you were getting Netskope off the ground, you had firm conviction that the world would go cloud first, SaaS first. But even back then, Salesforce was still a tiny little company. The average number of SaaS applications per company was, I think, 3 to 5, right? Now fast forward to 2020, can you talk about how you've seen this acceleration really change and what you've seen over the last 3 months?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the old world was, hey, I had my corporate device given to me, I sit on my network or I VPN in and I access stuff that is in my data center. Like, okay, so if you look at that, that's not how the world works anymore. People bring in personal devices. You access 50% of people's internet traffic in an enterprise is destined to the cloud. Every quarter and year that goes by, that increases. You look at how people work today. Well, they don't work from an office only, they work everywhere. 67% of people work remote now, used to be 27% pre-COVID. The whole world is transformed. And when you do that, COVID accelerates this whole notion of work from home, bring your own device, use cloud for a lot of reasons. And Satya's quote was a great one. But the summary, I think, for digital transformation is it was an inevitability, right? Even without COVID, it would happen. Security transformation would happen, right? There's, I think, $26.5 billion spent in security on appliances sitting in your network. Well, your network is not your network anymore. And so the macro view of what's happening in the market is that this inevitability of transforming your security stack as a result of digital transformation has just been accelerated a few years. And the redistribution of this, large amount of market cap that's in the world that is spent on, there's $150 billion in market cap in data network security companies. That redistribution has also been accelerated. And so I think, we have a lot of investors on the phone, we have folks, entrepreneurs. One of the great things about digital transformation, I think, and security transformation creates a lot of new opportunities because in our space, that $150 billion of market cap redistributed to companies who are cloud first, understand and make BYOD and partner access and remote working, not an exception, but the norm. And then in the same fold, I think you have a lot of disruption in the industry where because, legacy companies tend to milk their cash cows, the milking of that cash cow is not going to last much longer. And so I think digital transformation has a big effect on an enterprise, but it's also had a big effect, COVID has, on the acceleration of the redistribution of this market cap and the demise, I think, of some of the legacy security players.
Well, let's look at the other side of the coin. So, enterprises are changing their stack, they're adopting the cloud, people are working from home, and you both are benefiting to a certain extent from the tailwinds from customer interest. But what about the bad guys, right? The bad guys are looking at a new attack surface, they're looking at new behavior. I'm curious what both of you are seeing, whether it's in the IT side or on the OT side, how you're seeing the bad guys adapt and what your companies have done to really, change your behavior in this cat and mouse game. And maybe Sanjay, you can continue on where you left off.
Yeah, sure. So, I say that this situation of uncertainty, the pandemic, it's sort of the nirvana for an attacker. This is when they thrive. This is, frankly, when they're most effective. And uncertainty means you have a whole set of people now changing, working remote. Their old systems that were securing them are ineffective in those environments. You have people being furloughed, IT staffs being furloughed, security people, being furloughed. This is like the Nirvana, as the title is, of a attacker. And so for them, what are they doing? Well, you can just Google it. They're the most sadistic people in the world. They take healthcare and hospital networks and they shut them down, critical care facilities, and they hold them ransom. I mean, how sadistic can you be, right? At the most critical time where you need these facilities, they don't care. They're going to prey on people, and those people, they're going to pay because they need those facilities too. They take financial systems, right? And they extort money. They take, for example, COVID. I think there's a stat in like a week, 6,800 malicious domains created saying, COVID test, fake, COVID help, fake. And they're just trying to, attack you any way they can, take advantage of your uncertainty, your fear, your lack of staff. And so they have thrived. We have seen the amount of attacks increase. We have seen the amount of effective attacks increase. We have seen customers literally held hostage to them. And so it's a pretty stark, world. And the reality is, in that world, enterprises need to be even more vigilant, and they need to transform even more quickly, because the attackers, they're not going to wait. They're going to take advantage of them right now. And so we have a threat report we released, which actually summarizes all this, but definitely a world where COVID has meant acceleration of attackers.
Yikes. Galina, what are you seeing on the operational technology side?
Yeah,
I mean, you're talking about, power plants and hospitals and manufacturing sites.
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, Sanjay summarized it really well. I would like to add to that, attackers are learning. They're very creative and very smart. And so obviously operational technology networks that run critical processes are their kind of one of their most prized targets to go after, because as Sanjay said, you're going to pay the ransomware, right? If you're manufacturing something that is absolutely critical, you just, in a lot of cases, just pay and you don't have the time to go and investigate. So unfortunately, we've seen quite a lot of, cruelty going after exactly those most kind of critical processes that are essential for everything that's happening right now, whether that's healthcare, critical manufacturing, etc. And let's not forget that ransomware is just kind of one end of the spectrum of like purely opportunistic and financial gain. There's also quite a large angle here of nation state actors, right? That are exploiting the chaos in the Western world. And I don't want to say anything that's going to scare people away, but this is all public information. But if you read just even some of the reports from the DHS and the FBI about the presence of things like Russian nation state actors in the critical infrastructure of the United States, you can just kind of get a perspective of what they're thinking. And we haven't yet seen anything at a scale that is attacking a whole sector, but this is definitely not incomprehensible, right? Imagine, we just saw the damage from like random acts of very powerful cyber weapons like NotPetya a few years ago, and now you've got the ransomware to critical infrastructure networks. But you can imagine that if a nation state wants to take out the top 10 pharma companies, this is just definitely something from an infrastructure perspective that they can do. And one way in which we continue to bring awareness and solution to that space is, you can't fight what you don't know. So the challenge that we're facing is that operational technology networks are at least 25 years behind in terms of their cyber posture compared to the regular IT stack. And so the lack of visibility is making it very, very hard for the defenders to fight back. The lack of evidence for those attackers in your networks is not, evidence that they're not there. So what we focus is just making sure that defenders know what's in their networks, and so they can see when there are any penetrations and breaches to those networks. And I must say that from the many companies and prospects that we're working with in the last few months, there's definitely a difference between companies who have already kind of adopted that resilience and cloud infrastructure. They were able to adapt to the new reality much faster, whereas the ones that were running everything on premise, that had a huge technology impact, but also impact on the people, you know, being overworked, being stressed, trying to do everything. And so obviously attackers take advantage of that as well.
Pretty scary world out there. Wow. Well, I'm glad both of you guys have built solutions for us. Let's talk a little bit about how your companies have had to adapt. You know, how you've had to change your business model. You know, in the pre-COVID world, enterprises sold in a specific way. You know, enterprises marketed in a specific way. Galina, can you talk about how you've really motivated your team, shifted your resources, and changed your business model over the last 3 months?
Yeah. So we had to adapt to the reality of our clients. And, you know, especially in the first few weeks of the COVID crisis, you know, we mainly deal with like Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies. They were just basically paralyzed. And so we had to introduce flexibility on our side to help them make the decisions. So everything from very flexible financial terms, from a commercial standpoint, to changes that we needed to do in the product and how we deploy the product, right? So we couldn't go through that extensive proof of concept or proof of value on site. We had to find, you know, creative ways of how can we deploy that at, you know, dozens and hundreds of different sites. You know, the organizations that we work with, they've got manufacturing facilities, for example, in like 50 different countries. So we had to basically introduce flexibility into our commercial models as well as the product to facilitate the transition of the customers to this new reality. When it comes to our own employees, this for us was not a huge difference because we're all so distributed around the world. We operate out of, you know, a few continents because we have customers in all of these continents. So we were used to working in a remote setting, but definitely what we needed to change was the communication. Just because, you know, as human beings, there was just so much uncertainty. A lot of technology companies were laying off people, were furloughing people. And we were just we're very lucky and fortunate, I guess, to have enough money in the bank to not have to lay off anyone. If anything, we continued to hire during that period and just needed to reinforce that message to the team that we are in a very good position. You know, this is just a temporary pause, and this is indeed what we saw. You know, after a couple of months into the crisis, customers started adapting to this new reality. They started taking meetings again. They started running proof of concepts again, and just kind of the whole mechanism restarted in a much more effective way. But we definitely needed to reassure our teams that, you know, some of the massacre that's going out there in the industry is not going to affect us. And so that just required a lot of communication and a much closer, you know, staying in touch with people as we were going through this crisis.
Amazing. Sanjay, I've had a front row seat to your leadership. Can you talk a little bit about what you've done?
Yeah, and I build on what Galina said, which are all good points. And, you know, first, I look at our anything, whether it's our vision or changes, in 4 areas. One is our team. Our second is, you know, our product vision. Third is go to market. And our fourth is how we think about the company foundation structure. And so on a team point of view, we were built to be able to, fortunately, work remote, right? The systems that we had in place, the leveraging cloud apps, the way that people work. And so we did a survey amongst our base, and 80% said that working from home, they were the same or more productive. And that included, you know, we obviously have a large presence internationally, and that included international. Sales is obviously a little different in the sense that many of them love the face-to-face, you know, Fortune 500, meeting an enterprise, CIO, CISO, and so we had to adapt to that. But from a team point of view, the focus was keep people healthy and safe. We shut down our offices early. I don't plan to open my Beri or overseas office for the rest of the year. You know, so health and safety was the priority. Our culture is a big part of the company, and we want to make sure that, you know, we take care of our people. So that was number one. Number two was, from a product vision, there were no adjustments for us because we're built for this world of digital transformation. And so we're kind of in the bullseye of where the world is going. And so, no, it was more, hey, what do we need to accelerate? And what, you know, more can we be doing from a focus point of view in certain areas. But macro-wise, the product and vision, we stayed true to it because this just validated, accentuated, accelerated it. Go-to-market-wise, there were changes, right? If you're familiar with security, you know, those old-fashioned events, they generate demand. And the reality, they're gone. And so if you think about demand gen, and which is where your pipeline comes from, a quick shift to digital, a quick shift to you know, demand gen through not just webinars, but through fun events like whiskey tasting events and virtual poker. And so demand gen shift. Fortunately, we had brought on a great team led by, you know, Jana. She's just amazing. She led Palo Alto Networks marketing in Americas. And so really we were able to shift that digital so we could feed that funnel and pipeline and keep driving it. Our channel partners, really the investment there up front came through because one of the things I say to people is during this time, people want to buy from people they have some first level or second level connection to. And that connection, given the scale of companies, is often not your salespeople. It's your channel, it's your partners, it's your advocates. And so having a massive channel of our system have really helped. And then fourth, company foundation, as Galina mentioned, we got great backers, investors, and I would argue that, you know, frankly, during this time, the value of what both of us are doing as companies is even more clear. And so even raising capital in this market is not a problem. We both don't need to because we have capital for many years and hopefully all the way. But for other organizations, no doubt that was a question. But anyways, that's how I see it affecting us. The last thing I'll tell you is what we felt good about was when, you know, a hospital or healthcare facility calls you, when a manufacturing facility calls you, a company or financial and says, look, I need your help to continue to work, to be able to stand up healthcare facilities. I need your system implemented in the next 10 days so that I can securely enable my workers working on iPads remotely. And so in some small way, enabling these critical organizations to continue to operate has felt probably most validating for our team. And so that's the other piece that we've seen.
That's awesome. One last question for both of you before we shift to Q&A, because I want to make sure that everybody who's attending has a chance to ask some questions. But you're both entrepreneurs, you're both seasoned entrepreneurs. Can you touch on two questions? One, is now a good time to start a company in the security space? And two, do you have any advice for founders, entrepreneurs, in terms of how to raise capital and manage a team and build a team in this environment? And why don't you start first, Galina, and then we'll end with Sanjay.
Sure. We're actually just talking about this on the pre-briefing call. I think given all the changes in the acceleration, it's absolutely a great time to start a company in cybersecurity. The openness that we see from executives, from CIOs and CISOs, that is only going to accelerate. So if you've got an idea for technology that can go and replace, you know, 5 other things that are done in the old way on premise, or all that patchwork of security technologies that we have currently deployed on premise, if you've got an idea of how to simplify the life of a CISO, then you've got a winning value prop. And so I would say great time to start a company in cybersecurity. How to actually build it and go about doing that. I mean, for us that have been in the security industry, obviously having those conversations with pre-existing contacts that we have is very validating. That's kind of, I think, the best way to go about it. If you're new to cybersecurity, that maybe gives you a different and a fresh perspective on what the domain requires. So just start talking about the pain points. I think it's a great time to have those interviews with security leaders and just ask them, hey, you just went through like a nightmare scenario, probably the worst one in your 20 years career, you know, outside of breaches that you might have had. What is it that you wish you had in terms of the technology that will enable you to be more effective and your team to be more effective? So great time to have those conversations. Building a team, I think just as customers are building resiliency in their infrastructure, I think we have to think about building our teams and our own organizations in exactly the same way, right? So for me personally, this showed me that if face-to-face is important, but location doesn't really matter, right? And that just kind of expands your scope from just looking for talent in the Bay Area versus like literally looking for those folks globally. And so that just gives you more flexibility. All the companies of the future will be remote companies. So start with that in mind and start building culture as part of that remote working environment, because chances are we're never going to get back to 100% being on site all the time. And nor do we want to, because it gives us a lot more resilience, a lot more flexibility, and better contact with our customers. So if you have any ideas for companies, talk to me as well. I talk to a lot of CISOs, happy to bounce off ideas.
Awesome. And Sanjay, advice for founders and building a company in these times?
So, when you think about building a company in these times, there's also the pragmatic reality if you're a, Series A, B starting company, right? Companies do have budget cuts. They do have consolidation onto some core platforms, which is somewhat accelerated by this notion of, hey, they want to accelerate consolidation into a couple of core next-gen platforms. Time for your revenue may take longer if you're planning revenue and, they're cutting budgets. They may cut sort of the niche areas out. And so I want to spray some pragmatism on it, because I think what you want to plan for is you need to be on the right side of history. Very clear what is history now. COVID has accelerated history. History is, in the security market, a lot of those legacy companies, Symantec, McAfee, over time, Palo Alto, and others. And so when you think about security company, first, your vision, your product, you absolutely have to be right in the bullseye of the trends we all just talked about, right? So make sure that that's the case. Two, you have to build a plan that makes you realize that, look, maybe what I thought I would do from a go-to-market sales point of view may take a little longer, because if you're starting out, that budget will have, a lag now. And then three is, I do think you have to focus on this concept of, am I going to build a platform, or am I going to build a niche kind of product area? And by the way, nothing wrong with doing any one of those two, right? And so don't think, oh, I have to build this massive platform. Maybe you're a first-time entrepreneur and you're like, you know what? I'm going to build this. I'm going to be the best at it. And my outcome is I'm going to go, achieve X, or I'm going to go sell my company, or don't tell anybody, whatever your path is, you should pick that, but just be very pragmatic, right? Plan for a little longer time to revenue. Whatever you raise, make sure it lasts longer. 3, make sure you're on the right side of history. And then 4, make sure you're taking care of that redistribution of market cap very clearly, and how it's going to happen to you. So know who your competitors that you're displacing are. And so anyways, those are some of the thoughts I would have.
Awesome advice. And just from the venture side, I would say that we are very excited about looking and even investing in new companies at the seed or Series A stage. And even in COVID, we're meeting people over Zoom. We're getting comfortable with new entrepreneurs over Zoom, and we are investing. And in fact, we have made a couple of undisclosed investments in the security space over the last few months. So we are absolutely open for business. Laura, I'll turn it over to you. And
that's great to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, this is such an enlightening conversation. I actually have a question before we kick it over. We've got someone else in the audience who has a question as well. Some folks are raising their hands. So for those of you who raised your hands, you can just type your question in the Q&A and we'll call on you. And for anyone else who's got a question for Arif, who has not been in the hot seat yet, Sanjay or Galina, please do enter that in the Q&A. My question is actually related to what regulatory or policy type frameworks make doing what you do different in different countries, if at all, or if the cybersecurity space is kind of like, greenfield territory for you to write the rules. Like, is there a difference between fighting cybercrime in Canada versus the US, or in Russia versus the US, or I would just love to hear your perspective on that.
Galina, you want to go first? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'll take it in the more narrow kind of sense of critical infrastructure, and then Sanjay, you can expand it to the broader network. So, you know, adversaries don't play by the rules. So I kind of have this cynical view of standards and recommendations. They're just, you know, they're a bunch of, you know, instructions, basically. I see them as like the Bible, you shall do this. How many companies actually implement the standards and the recommendations is a completely different story. So for operational technology, cybersecurity, which is extremely relatively new on the broader scope of cybersecurity, we do have, you know, things like the NIST framework, subsections that are specific to OT, standards like IC 62443, etc. But of course, for electric utilities in the US, there's Netskope. I personally haven't seen, you know, those kind of regulations push practical cybersecurity solutions so much as they just push compliance. So at least, you know, from my part of the world, in terms of operational technology, a lot of it is box checking when people are thinking about compliance to those regulations. So it hasn't practically helped us a lot. What has really helped is having security leaders that are aware of the risk and then thinking through how they can reduce the risk. So that's on the regulations. As to whether crime is different, again, from my narrow view of critical infrastructure, adversaries kind of come in few flavors, but the two major ones are financial gain, you know, mainly ransomware, etc. And these ones, you know, it's kind of, you know, you from all over the place when it comes to the nation states. Definitely the ones that we worry about the most are China because of IP theft and Russia because of the kind of the geopolitical agenda there. Sanjay, how do you see things in the more broader?
Yeah, I think like, so if you look at standards, they, first of all, there are standards by area. So GDPR in Europe, you know, is probably one of the top of mind things for CISOs and CIOs. It, you know, 4% of your, you know, top line, you can be fined. You can be fined per incident, $20 million. You have in South Africa, you have POPI, and Latin America, you got LGDP, in California, you got Privacy Act, and every place has a regulation which has now teeth to it, costs money, gets the attention of a CFO. Once you get the attention of a CFO, okay, audit and compliance groups are separate groups than security. Why do they have an audit and compliance group? Because they kind of care about these things, and if they don't meet them, you don't meet the standards in a financial organization that you're supposed to around PCI, well, you're in trouble. And so it does matter. And I think the thing that matters for people when they think about those standards is protect their employee, protect their customer data, right? Personal privacy. And if you breach that privacy, as you've seen, you're going to get fined and it's going to affect your bottom line. And so I think what that means is good security hygiene, as Galina was saying, is the key, right? Make sure that you're protecting your data. That's the key. Protect your data. And if you protect your data, that's kind of what all these standards mean, is protect your data so you don't expose your customers and your employees' personal information. Obviously, you care about your own IP as well, but the laws are more attributed to your personal and your customer and employee information. And so, yeah, it's a big driver.
So thank you for that. Let's turn over to Mike Vogel, who's got a question. And Mike, I know who you are, but maybe others don't. So if you could introduce yourself and tell us where you're calling in from, that'd be great. We'll just find you and unmute you.
Great. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, hi, this is Mike Vogel. I work at CPP Investments, and we recently, it really was a privilege for us. We had the privilege of being able to invest in Netskope earlier this year. So the one question I had for both, I guess all three of the speakers were, you talked about some current changes in the overall IT ecosystems. Wondering what your opinions are on how Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have addressed security issues across their broad cloud offerings. Thanks.
Okay, I can start if you want. Yeah, so I think if you look at those three folks specifically, One of the strategies of any Google, Microsoft, and others is not just in security, but in general, is to attempt to how to converge, right? Bundle things. They did the same thing with Slack, right? Microsoft Teams they're trying to, try to do it with other companies. In the security world, here's the reality, right? Every enterprise has 1,000 cloud applications. A fraction of them are from a Microsoft or a Google or an Amazon, usually a combination. They have 2+ public clouds. They don't just use Microsoft or Google, they use both. They got 1 billion websites to protect that aren't owned by those people. And they have their own on-premise apps that are still there. They SAPs, Concurs, GitHub and so on. And so the reality, I think, in security is that one of the things you want is a consistent model to cover all of your assets. And the reality is all of your assets don't live in any one of those places. They live in thousands of places. And so for many CISOs, architects, CIOs, what they've realized is, wait a minute, if I buy XYZ from a cloud provider, it doesn't help me create a consistent data protection framework, threat protection framework across them all. And so I think in that specific space, in our specific space, that sort of is what makes sense architecturally. Where you fight then and where you may run into them is, I'm a believer that all of those folks, they're actually partners because you integrate with different parts of their ecosystem. For example, in our case, a vast majority of the Microsoft Office traffic actually goes through Netskope every day to be secured. A lot of the largest Google customers use us. And so I think we view them as partners, but also you know that sometimes they encroach, on the edges in what you do. And so that's kind of how I think about it in our space. But Galina, why don't you weigh in on how you think about it?
Yeah, I would say very similar. I mean, they're a significant part of the infrastructure, but our world is so complex that it really cannot be oversimplified to just Amazon and Google providing the security that you need. It just, I don't think this is realistic. This is why we kind of have to have all of these standards and consistent way of treating the data and the access to the data in the cloud. And this is where a lot of other solutions come into play. It's good to see developments from their side, but again, I think they are and will just continue to be an infrastructure player, as in they're one component of the solution, but they're not the whole solution. And in my mind, just given the complexity of requirements and just the complexity and diversity of infrastructure, I don't think that they will ever be the sole kind of provider of security for those environments. It's just the world we live in is way more complex than that, and we need a lot more granular access, security, and different models that run across all of your cloud infrastructure.
Great. Well, let's move on to another question here. David, no. David has a pretty interesting question. David, introduce yourself to everyone here. Great to see you, by the way.
Hey, nice to see you too. Nice to see you too. Hope everybody can hear me.
Yeah, we can.
So kind of, I get two questions. Maybe I'll mix them into one. But the first one is that I'm curious about what you're seeing as the best acquisition strategy for customers. Most, CISOs and security teams are very hesitant to inbound by nature. And so I was curious on what you've seen as the best way to acquire customers. And then the part B to that question is, I've heard from some cybersecurity companies that, the low-hanging fruit or those that are most motivated are those that have already incurred some sort of a security breach. So I'm curious on whether or not you see that target market as being a priority, those that have had a breach, and what is the best acquisition strategy for them? Thanks. And by the way,
oops. Just a sec, David.
Go ahead.
Sorry, sorry, just forgot to mention, I'm a fintech VC with a couple of financial institutions as LPs, and obviously cybersecurity is a priority for them.
Awesome. That's great. Where do we want to start there? I think it'd be also interesting to hear Arif's perspective because he sees so many different companies in that space. But maybe Galina, it sounded like you had something to say. So why don't we start off with you, and then if Arif, if you've got a response too to that.
Sure. I just wanted to react to a couple of things that that David mentioned. So one is, this concept that security teams are hesitant to inbound requests. Actually, maybe it's because we operate in a market segment that is relatively new. But my experience has been that when you deliver something that is of value, that is aligned with what security teams are looking for right now, they're actually quite open to some of those inbound requests, as long as they're done in a way that's obviously respectful and that it provides value right away versus just, hey, can I have 15 minutes of your time? So again, that just might be a function of the fact that we're operating in a very blue ocean and everyone needs operational technology, cybersecurity right now. Obviously, the other one is existing partners and integrators that are kind of the trusted advisors to some of those large companies. That is obviously a very established channel for a lot of security companies that sell to the Fortune 500. And the other point was about if companies have experienced breaches. I think that I'm not a fan of this ambulance chasing kind of strategy of like, something bad happened and then you go and you try to sell them something just because it's not good all around, I think for obvious reasons. But what we've seen as a positive trend is how companies engage with you depends very much on the maturity of their security team. And to a large extent, that has to do with, the person in charge, the CISO or the security leader. So what we've seen of a very positive trend where a lot of the more advanced security teams actually have dedicated scouting teams that actually go and look for new technologies proactively and think about how they can disrupt their own security stack and how they can cut down from, using 75 products to using something that's going to be a lot more integrated, a lot more comprehensive, vis-a-vis the platform approach that Sanjay mentioned a couple of times. They're looking for simplicity. So I would say, maybe a better strategy than chasing the ambulances is just trying to find those organizations, and they're not hard to find, that are very proactive in their security posture and going after them. The financial industry is a great example of that. There are some banks out there that allegedly don't even have a limit on their security budget, and they're very, very proactive in how they address security. So actually, it's a very good segment to start with.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly, across our portfolio, we found our portfolio companies that have been most creative in terms of bringing together communities of people and really making it not about just selling, but making it a community-based discussion around digital transformation and how CISOs can help each other or CIOs can learn from each other and best practices. That has really been a really strong go-to-market motion for a lot of our companies, as well as obviously webinars, but also personalized EBCs that are completely online, that are very tailored to a specific organization's needs and a particular organizational challenges. So again, we're not fans of ambulance chasing, but bringing together communities and bringing together targeted materials to that company around their digital transformation has been very, very useful.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. We've got one more question. I'm going to try to fit it in here. I think we should direct it maybe to Sanjay and Arif, just because Sanjay, you haven't spoken in a couple minutes, you might have a perspective on this too. We're going to Helen Vasilevsky. Helen, tell us where you're calling in from, introduce yourself briefly and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. I'm Helen Vasilevsky. I am a Canadian global nomad based in Switzerland and help companies expand globally, so commercial strategy and route to market. One of the groups that I've been aligned with for the past few years as a marketer, I do penance for data privacy and data security, because as marketers, we cull data all over the place. And the question, and the company, what they're doing is hardware, software. So your companies that you've communicated, and a lot of the security industry is focused on software. So what I'd like to understand is there a role for hardware, or is it just an added complication and software will cover the majority of the needs from a security standpoint?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so I give it this answer. Like, the reality is that one of the biggest trends in the world is the distribution of number of devices. Could be IoT devices, could be, personal devices, could be, and those are all hardware devices. And so when you think about that, a lot of that security for those just can't be stuck on the device. But there is a component that will live on the device, but it's software still living on hardware. And so I guess, like, whenever someone asks about hardware, what I tell them is hardware is just another vehicle for software to run. And in some cases, for example, in a DoD network, or in, highly classified Intel network, or in some manufacturing, or in an IoT-rich environment, where your security software will run will be hardware, because maybe they want it to run in their infrastructure, and so on. And so I think there is a place, but it's more as, in my view, for specific use cases. Too, most of that hardware is cloud connected in some way. And what I mean by that is, you want to take advantage of the power of analytics, the breadth of processing, the machine learning you can do, and putting that in a piece of hardware or appliance is hard, right? Because it's just constrained. And so usually what you find, even in those specific use cases, is hardware tethered to the cloud. And so it's kind of a hybrid solution where you leverage hardware because of some nuance, but you tether it to the cloud, where you can take advantage of the vastness of processing and distribution. So that's kind of how I think about it. It's sort of why is an enterprise, at some level, still, X% hybrid, not all 100%, cloud. Same concept, I think. So.
Yeah, really, really quickly, I would add that there still will be a market for hardware-based appliances, hardware-based devices. However, over the next 5 to 10 years, that will unfortunately be on the wrong side of history. So today, there are still companies that do require hardware. There are still organizations like the DoD, like government, like very, very large enterprises that will want hardware, but it's increasingly becoming hybrid, and that hybrid ends in the cloud. And so what you end up seeing is compute and storage for many, many years, was servers that were bought and storage devices that were bought by enterprises. There are still companies that buy that stuff, but increasingly you rent it by the minute or by the hour from Amazon, from Microsoft, from Google, right? The same thing will happen with security over time. And so software and cloud is where the world is going over the next decade. And that's where, as investors, we tend to look. We don't want to be in the wrong side of history.
Fascinating. Well, we're going to close off our conversation there because we're a little bit over time. Thank you so much for staying with us. It looks like everybody really wanted to hear the end of that as well. Sanjay, Galina, Arif, thank you so much for sharing so much of your knowledge and investing in the brain trust of this community by sharing it. We are so grateful and just grateful that there are people like you building security companies that really ultimately protect all of us and businesses everywhere. So thank you so much. Happy belated Canada Day. And to keep an eye out for an email later today to everybody. We'll have the recording of this session as well as a brief survey. You can tell us how we did or what else you'd like to hear about. Thank you so much. Wishing you all a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.